Hey, hi everybody. I'm Vashti. This class came about because I was looking at paintings of Persian clothing and trying to sort out what was going on and realized we don't have a really good handle on how to break down Persia into a more nuanced understanding. So we're going to look very specifically at the 14th century, and even within that, we're going to look at what's coming out of the Il-Khanid Dynasty. So this is not all Persian miniatures. It's not even all Persian miniatures happening in the 14th century. There's just so much that gets grouped under the word Persia. Um, really what I'm hoping to do is start to break down that big umbrella term. It used to be the Middle East was our big umbrella term, and now Persia has gotten a little bit smaller in terms of what we're covering. We have Persia and we have Anatolia and we have Egypt. There's still so much going on with that. This is just going to start to, unfortunately, not give you all the answers because I don't have them all, but it will start to give you a more nuanced understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about Persian miniature paintings. And a big part of that is, okay, how does religion affect that and what culture is actually being represented when we look at a painting? Um, my big thing is that understanding that context and how that art was created is going to help not only help us understand what's going on in the art, but it's going to help us have a much more respectful recreation. So before we dive into 14th century, I do want to talk about what came before and how we got to the Il-Khanid dynasty. And especially what's happening with painting, because if you've tried to look for Persian painting before the 14th century, you're a bit out of luck. There's a reason all of those paintings are 14th to 16th century. Most of the earlier stuff was destroyed. It did exist. They did paint people. A lot of people outside of studying Middle Eastern personas will say, oh, well, it was because of Islam they didn't do figures. That's not the case at all. That is a very heavy-handed interpretation of one line in the Quran, and it's not how it was interpreted for most of the history of Persia. So starting with pre-Islamic Persia, this is pre-7th century. There were murals, there were other religious works. So you have Zoroastrian and Manichaeism, both of which featured lots of figural artwork in their religious texts. And we even had some portraits on silk. Most of these no longer exist. We know about the religious works because other people have written about them. Very few of the Manichaeist texts survive. We have a little bit more of the Zoroastrian texts. And most of the murals that still survive have been intentionally defaced. The figures are painted over or crossed out. Part of this was showing new allegiances to new groups that had come in, so they were intentionally breaking with the styles that had come before. And painting on paper just did not survive. We have references to it, but it was never a high status thing. And the materials just didn't survive through the years. So we have a lot of documentary sources on figural painting from around the 11th century. So we know that was still going on well after Islam came into the area. It was not happening in conjunction with the religious text, and it was not happening in the religious buildings. And we'll get into a little more detail of how Islam affected painting in a minute. But we know from text sources, people talk about painters and that painting was being done. And they talk about the subject matter and that people were subjects of paintings. So we know it still existed even though we don't have those paintings. What we do have are ceramics. We have painted and molded architectural tiles that have people on them, and we have remnants of murals. Most of what we see in these are origin myths and hunting and legendary scenes. We see a lot of hunting and feasting scenes around like enthronements. So this is something depicting the lives of upper class people and royalty and what they would be doing. As far as I know, none of them are depicting specific people. They are depicting characters from origin legends. So this is some of the Zoroastrian style art. So it's from 224 to 241. It is very heavily influenced by the Hellenistic world. And this is a sketch of a rock carving. And then this is after Islam has come to the area. We have a lot of figures on ceramics. The Abbasid Caliphate has a very stylized look. And then the Greater Seljuk state has what's called the Seljuk International style. Again, we don't have paintings that survive from Persia, but we do have lots of ceramics in this style. And you can see it's a pretty dramatic step away from that Hellenistic look that we had in the rock carvings. One of the really fascinating things we have happening with painting from the very beginning in Persia all the way through the Islamic era on into the Mongol era is we have painting linked with text. Very early, it's linked to religious texts. So almost every painting that is referenced is honoring either a person in the royal family or a deity. But they're all associated with written passages. Even the murals on the walls would have quotes from poetry or religious texts or the origin myths with the paintings. And some walls don't have any paintings, they just have scriptures written on them. So in my mind, it almost went to, like, some of my friends will paint murals from like Alice in Wonderland on their kids' nursery walls and put quotes from C.S. Lewis or Tolkien. And it was like, oh, okay, so they're putting their famous writings on the wall and then illustrating them. Okay, that's something we still do. That's kind of cool. In the 11th century, we have a pretty big change that happens in Persian history. So we've had, when I talk about Persia, I'm talking about the Indo-Iranian cultural linguistic group that's indigenous to Iran and Iraq. 7th century, you have Arab Islamic groups come in and take over, and they kind of mix, and everything is still called Persia, even though they're being ruled by an outside group. 11th century, about half of the Persian Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, is lost to the Seljuks who've come in from Central Asia. And the big change in that, it's not just, oh, it's another outside group, is that you've had a large chunk of this empire taken over by a nomadic group, by a group that does not have a monotheistic religion already, that does not have a single ruler necessarily. They rule by family groups. And they continue, even after they've come in and taken over a chunk of the Persian Empire, to change residents multiple times a year. So one of the things we see under the Seljuks is that books began to become a popular thing, not just the Quran, but other books are starting to be produced in manuscript centers. And one of the major theories there is that this is an easily portable thing, and it's incredibly expensive to make. So it meets the criteria for what these groups were interested in terms of, I'm showing off my wealth and I can take it with me. One of the things that we also see with this group, one of the theories as to why books became a big deal as you start to have this new group come in, is that this is a group that doesn't speak the language of either the indigenous population or the ruling group. So they didn't speak Persian, they didn't speak Arabic. So how do you rule a group you can't talk to and a bureaucratic class you can't talk to? There are a lot of connections with the bureaucratic class and the merchant class who had traveled through Central Asia, becoming translators between the groups. And that has a huge impact on the government because that's kind of the real center of power, even though they're not the top of the food chain. But we have lots of theories that come up about illustration being a way to communicate across those language barriers. And in the very beginning of this, usually 12th, 13th century, we start to see that we have illustrations very directly depicting the concepts of the text. So we think that may have been what was going on. Later on, as you get more people who have learned the languages of the groups they're trying to govern, you see less and less of that. The illustrations kind of wander further and further away from the direct translation of what the text is saying. So as we get into what's happening with painting very specifically, painting has a language. It has intention from the artist, and it has an audience that is, for a successful artist, going to understand what's being said. And in the West, there are very specific rules because they are communicating largely what's in the Bible to an illiterate population. So the Virgin Mary wears a certain shade of blue, Mary Magdalene has red hair, John the Baptist wears a bearskin. You can recognize these characters no matter what language you speak. And you can see the scene, and you've heard this story all your life growing up in the church. You have an idea of what's happening. We don't know all of the rules for Eastern painting. But part of that is they weren't illustrating their religious text. The Quran was not being illustrated, largely because the population was literate. You didn't need to do that to spread your religion. They could read the book. So illuminating the manuscript, giving it really fancy borders and paintings around it, with that, where you have floral or geometric elements, became a big deal and became a very high value skill and a very high value job. Painting people and illustrating the scenes wasn't a thing. So when you do get painting coming in, we see painting as part of the book arts. So as people were starting to do the Book of Kings, which is the Shahnameh, it's the Persian origin myths and then some history. Or you get rulers who are commissioning a history of their ancestors. Those are what we see being illustrated in terms of paintings with people in them. And sort of as part of this understanding that painting figures is allowed, but it's not really boosted and approved under Islam. They sort of walked this line in terms of, well, it's a much lower status thing than calligraphy. There's not a huge market for it. So instead of doing portraiture, they were actually doing what we would think of as cartoons. I am illustrating this story. I'm not painting a realistic picture of a specific person. And we really don't see portraiture show up again until very late in the 16th century, in the Safavid era. So most of the modern scholarship, when they talk about painting, they very much call it illustration versus the illumination that's happening with the Quran and manuscripts where they're doing fancy borders on them. But what they're talking about with illustration for painting, these are stylized characters that are set in an imaginary setting. Even when they're depicting real battles that supposedly took place, they're usually so many generations removed. They're not going out and painting the real landscape that was there. They're making it very fanciful and very clearly not the real world. Okay, so now we are caught up to 14th century. That's the background of where we get into, hey, the guy in charge is setting up a manuscript center in multiple cities and commissioning and spending lots of money on making books with illustrations in them. So the Il-Khanids, are Mongols who have come and taken over Persia. So the green area is their largest extent of territory. We're really going to talk about Tabriz and a little bit in Shiraz for their major manuscript centers. So it gets called Persia, but most of the paintings that are coming out of this aren't in Iran and Iraq. They're coming out of totally different areas, even though we're still calling them Persian miniatures. So this is a group of Mongols who came in under Temujin and reached Baghdad around 1258. They tried to go down and take over Egypt too, and got kicked out, and they came back in and decided to focus on rebuilding Iran. And then, as this nomadic group does, the main guys in charge left a bunch of governors in different cities, and then they went back to the east. So as long as they're getting the taxes from over here, they're not real hands-on. So Il-Khan is actually the title of the governors that were left in the area. So this is a dynasty, but not how we typically think of it. It's not entirely one family group. It does start out that way, and then it branches further and further afield. So it's a very, very extended family, if anything. And instead of the family name being what we're calling this dynasty, we're actually calling them by their title. So instead of like King of Kings or the supreme ruler, this is like the sub king. So it's not the Khan, it's the Il-Khan. This is still a largely nomadic culture, but at this point, the people who've come in and taken over are mostly literate, not only in Chinese, but also a little bit in Arabic. They're familiar with it just from interactions in Central Asia between the two groups. And their major policy, even when they were coming in and taking over, was that if you were useful to them, they tried not to kill you. So bureaucrats and artisans largely survived. So when we get to kind of the third governor of Persia at this point, he actually converted to Islam. Previously, they'd been Buddhist or Christian. And oddly enough, he converted to Shiite Islam, which is not what the majority of Persia was. The majority of Persia was Sunni. There's a whole big cluster of what happened there and why that happened the way it did. And it has to do with the decline of the Abbasid Caliphate, late 10th, early 11th century. So he is kind of the first of the Mongols to really both stick around and convert to Islam. And one of the cities he's in charge of is Tabriz. And this becomes a huge thriving center of international trade. And it becomes one of the first major manuscript centers that consistently puts out books regularly, specifically illustrated books. So really, that third governor is the beginning of seeing books really thrive in Persia once again. But Ghazan is really considered the golden age for Mongol Islam, and very specifically books. Almost all the major cities had workshops, and every time a governor who had been patronizing the arts in a city was deposed, the artist picked up and left and went to another city where they heard the governor over there is paying really well for this type of art. So we have almost no signatures on the artwork at this stage. We don't know if they were slaves or employees who were being paid and housed. But we do know you can sometimes identify a specific style in a specific workshop, and then you can see, oh, here's the year where that governor was deposed, and then you see that show up again in, the next city or two over. That style starts to show up over there. There are huge, huge swings in the variety of skill level and style, even within one workshop. So who is actually doing the painting and where are they from is anybody's guess, based on tax records and inventories and data about, who has been brought from where and why was this work coveted over another. We know we had painters from China and Syria and Mesopotamia all working in Tabriz. They all did different styles, and it depends on who was doing the commission and who it was intended for as to which style the work was done in. Chinese artwork at this point really had a focus on space and a balance in the composition, and Persian artwork did not. They liked their composition to be entirely full. Every inch of space is being used up. So when we get them mixed together in this workshop in Tabriz, we see um, brush techniques and landscape motifs that are being carried across um, sort of both styles, but we get a lot of, Chinese brushwork technique, but Persian composition. And then we get landscape and specifically the flora that you don't see in Persia showing up in Persian artwork. So we can kind of tell a little bit from some of that at the beginning who's doing which paintings. So this is the funeral of Isfandiar, and it's attributed to the Tabriz workshop around 1330. And this is from a Shahnameh. And Shahnameh is a book of kings, and it's the history of the Persian people from the beginning of time up through the Samanid dynasty. So it relies on texts from long, long before the Samanid dynasty to come up with their stories. And it goes from origin myth into not eyewitness account, but somewhat legitimate history for the Samanid dynasty. So looking at some of these workshops, the more powerful the dynasty, the more artwork comes out of it, and the higher the skill level and quality of the artwork that comes out of it. And part of this was legitimizing their power, and they were demonstrating their connection to Persia. So one of the things that happens in Persia is if you are of the ruling class, if you are of even the high level bureaucratic class, patronizing the arts is a thing you do. It is not just something you can do, but it's almost seen as a responsibility. So them patronizing artwork is one of the ways they're saying, no, 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 we belong here. We're one of you. Several of the workshops, especially in the city of Tabriz, created text in both Arabic and Persian. And some of them from kind of the inscription page at the front were being created under the patronage of a Mongol leader, specifically to be sent out to more rural areas. So this was a little bit closer to what we see in the West with illustrating a Bible to tell people what was happening in the story. Although in this case, they're not illustrating a religious text. The thing that gets illustrated the most is the Book of Kings, is the Shahnameh. So they're sending out very expensive history of the people to more poor areas, and they're doing it in the language of those people. So it's very much not about the patron who is doing this. The reason he's doing that is to fulfill his social obligation and to show off his wealth. There's really a limited market for painting outside of the princes that are doing this and the governors that are doing this. But this show of wealth is incredible. So workshops have more than 40 people. And even if these are slaves that you're not paying a wage, you're housing them and feeding them and clothing them and providing the materials. That still gets to be incredibly expensive because there's at least one in each of the major cities. The other thing to keep in mind is that the early Il-Khanid princes weren't literate. They had really no interest in this book as literature. The later ones began to actually practice calligraphy themselves as they had learned the languages. But early on, it was, okay, why are you patronizing books? And it was, okay, that theory about illustrating them to tell the story might make sense. And then you get into who's commissioning these. Because it may not be the governor or the prince. It may actually be the head of the bureaucratic class who's helping this new guy who's in charge fit in better. And it may be that he's trying to help teach this guy how to fit in better with Persians. by illustrating the Persian history for him. So some of them focus a lot on what's your role as a ruler in terms of what's being illustrated. Within the workshop, kind of speaking to some of the expense of this, gold is the most frequently used material. And it's not just a color, this is gold leaf coming from North Africa. So all of the yellow in some of these is very flat and distorted because of how they have to take the picture to get it to show up rather than just shining. But all of that yellow is gold leaf. So these are incredibly expensive pieces, especially when you have a book that has 24 paintings in it like that. Aside from the gold leaf, most of the paints are similar to gouache, and the pigments come imported from all over the world. So even just as a plain color and not something that's gold leaf, it's an expensive thing to get. So this is not a one-person job, even for one painting. Preparing the paper is one specialty, preparing the colors is another. Painting certain types of things is going to be one skill set versus painting another type of subject is going to be another, whether that's a landscape versus a figure, or they want it done in a specific style. So you're going to have at least 3 different people working on a single painting just because of the preparation versus the application tends to be 2 different specialties. And again, it's really unclear if these artists are slaves or if they're paid, although my theory tends to be that even if they're being paid, a lot of times, at least at the beginning, when a new group has come in and taken over, you don't have a whole lot of choice in staying or leaving or what city you end up going to. There's a lot of writing about, oh, so-and-so came in and took over the city and he brought artists back with him to his capital over here. And I'm like, I don't think that was an ask. I think that was taking slaves with him. Whether or not they eventually ended up in a skill set that received a wage in addition to being lodged and fed and clothed, I don't think they had a lot of self-determination, especially under the Il-Khanids, where painting is still not a high status thing. By the Safavids, painting becomes more high status and you get a little bit more leeway there. But again, you have artists of all different backgrounds, and I'm not sure how they communicated with each other. We also run into an issue of who assigned the work, who assessed it, who decided what was high enough quality for one project or another, or what the themes were going to be for one project versus another. Especially for the Il-Khanids and in the early era of the Il-Khanids, best guess is that this was the bureaucratic class who was doing this and not the actual guy who was paying for it, who was the governor or the prince, mainly because of what subject matter was chosen and how the books were then used or valued. They weren't really being treated as literature. They're being done in the languages that the ruling class doesn't speak. And then a lot of them are then being sent out elsewhere. So they were very much a symbol of value and wealth and a symbol of this new person from elsewhere fulfilling a social obligation and not so much them actually wanting a book. So major themes for this era. Again, the subjects are of very little importance. The main thing they were concerned with was how rich the representation is. How much gold leaf did you use? How expensive were the materials? Where did you get them from? Some of this information is documented in inscriptions at the beginning or the end of these books. And sometimes a lot of these books have now been scattered. So we have a few pages from one and a couple of single paintings from another, as opposed to a whole intact book. But we get other people who are writing about them, and we get bills for them and tax documents about them in inventories. And we get comments from court historians or detractors if somebody thinks this guy is spending too much money on this stuff. He'll write rude things about him. So we get a lot of other kind of court gossip about how much is being spent. Is it worth the quality? What is he doing with his time and money type of comments. And the fact that there is so much written about this and so much focus on it tells us that this was actually an important thing to these people. Again, not so much because it's a beautiful painting or of what the subject was, but how much money is being spent and which governor has the best workshop, and was he able to kidnap or lure an artist from one guy's workshop into his own.
Sorry to
Uh,
interrupt,
uh-huh.
but somebody had a question asking about if they were using shell gold.
If they were using what now?
Shell gold.
That I don't know. And that is my own lacking part. I do not know. I've seen it referred to as gold and gold leaf, but I have not seen other terms for it. I'm dealing largely with secondary sources, so it could be a translation issue. I'm also dealing with stuff that deals with the art, fairly secondary to the history. So I'm sure that kind of information is probably out there. I just haven't found it yet. Any other questions before I keep going? Because I do just kind of get on a roll. Okay. So for subject matter, primarily at this point, we are looking at historical events, but much more to the glory of whoever is paying me to paint this thing. So the wars and triumphs of this guy or his ancestors, the origin myths, and then some mystical poems. The most common thing we find is Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, very specifically. There are at least 10 illustrated copies from the 14th century. And again, the running theory in the scholarship is that the Persian bureaucrats were using this to teach the Il-Khanids the history of Persia and what their role as rulers is supposed to be. So the Shahnameh and the Shahnameh is a big misnomer. Shahnameh is almost a genre. Book of Kings and kind of Persian origin myths are all referred to as Shahnameh. Ferdowsi's is a very specific writing of one. It's an epic poem. Again, that covers from the beginning of the Persian people through the mid-10th century. So that early stuff is very fanciful. Ferdowsi is a member of the landowning aristocracy, and there was a Samanid ruler who gathered a bunch of scholars together from Eastern Iran. His qualification was you have to be familiar with Pahlavi, which is Middle Persian, and you had to be Zoroastrian. And he wanted these guys to write this epic history. He was commissioning it. So there's not a single version of the Shahnameh. There are lots and lots of versions of it. Ferdowsi's version wasn't just written by Ferdowsi. It was written by at least 2 other people as well. And it makes use of actual historic sources as far back as the Achaemenid court. But none of those were illustrated until the 14th century. So there's a really big disconnect between what we in the SCA refer to as the Shahnameh. We're typically referring to Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. But Ferdowsi's Shahnameh just refers to the writing. It was not illustrated in his lifetime. And then the illustrations in this vary dramatically. It was illustrated from the 14th century on, and everyone illustrated it differently. They didn't always illustrate the same passages, and they didn't illustrate them in the same way. So if you're pulling an image from the Shahnameh, it's an illustration, so it's almost a cartoon. It's not intended to be set in the real world. And who knows what they're actually illustrating, because they tend to get, the later you get with them, the less directly they're illustrating the passage next to it. So for that kind of artwork, you really need to look at which workshop it's attributed to, when it was painted, and who commissioned it to get a little bit of that background of, okay, what was this artist actually doing? What did his patron want? Who was the recipient? What was their goal in building the scene this way? So looking at Tabriz, we frequently have this very light style. This is early Tabriz artwork. We'll get into a little bit later stuff gets a lot of influence from Shiraz, and we'll see that change here in a minute. But the early stuff has lots of the bare page still visible behind the painting. We get landscapes that are brushed and diluted, and sometimes they actually extend beyond kind of the boundary box. So you'll have tree branches that extend out. And we get lots and lots of fauna in these paintings that are not typical in Persia or even in the Middle East in general. We'll get clearly things that look like bamboo or things that look like certain types of flowers that just aren't seen in that landscape. Aside from the Shahnameh, The History of the World by Tawarik is probably the second most commonly illustrated work that we see in this century. And again, big, vast subject matter, history of the world. A lot of it tends to be origin myth, and then it tends to be very specifically for the glory of the dynasty and the guy that is paying him to do it. So what subjects get illustrated in this work change depending on who's commissioning the illustration. The writing is all very specific about the dynasty that commissioned him. So again, we get lots of bare page being seen even through the painting. We almost get more of an outline style than a fill style. With this kind of wash that we get in the painting, we don't actually see drawing underneath it, which I always found interesting. So we get this, but we don't have preliminary drawing lines beneath it. We also almost always have a boundary box around it, and those are usually more brightly colored than the rest of the scene. So they had more color available. They were very much choosing not to use it in this style. The kind of range of figures, we almost don't get a horizon line in some of these, but the placement of the figures is an attempt at indicating depth, but it still tends to come out very flat looking. This one is specifically is an enthronement scene, and you end up with the more important people are larger at this era. So the guys at the top right on the throne, that couple, those are the important ones. Everybody else gets a little bit smaller and then arranged to kind of try and give the room a sense of depth. And then we start getting a little more color coming in as we kind of move through the century, but they still end up being very gentle colors. We also see a lot of, they refer to them frequently as contorted figures. It's not just that they're contorted, but they don't look stiff in their movements. Some of the other styles that we see, the limbs look incredibly rigid. This gives a much more kind of soft and fluid look to the people. And the faces actually have some expressions to them, which is a nice change from some of the other styles where it's the same oval face with almost no face on it, on everybody there. So this is getting into Rashid al-Din's workshop. And Rashid Hamdani is a Jewish physician who converted to Islam, and he actually became a really important guy in the government. So he became not only a physician to one of the Mongol governors, but he became kind of the general counsel. And this is during Ghazan's time, who is considered kind of the golden age for artwork. He commissioned one of Tawarik's History of the World, and he commissioned that through Hamdani's workshop in Tabriz. So this is a massive undertaking. It's 400 pages, written pages, and it has 110 illustrations, most of which still survive. But you can see that it's fairly dramatically different from the other images I've shown you here. We start to get more of a fill style than just the outline. We get a little bit brighter colors. We get a little bit more active scene happening, and we still see some of those elements from the other style. So we have the boundary boxes, we have some of the spears are extending out of it, and we still have folks that are fairly fluid as opposed to really stiff and rigid, and we have some difference in expression happening with them. So Hamdani's workshop is one of the ones we know did works both in Arabic and Persian, and then sent them all over the empire. So commissioning something in his workshop is essentially commissioning two somethings. So instead of one 400-page book with 110 illustrations, it was double that. So the expense that's coming out of there is incredible. This is starting to show some of the infiltration that's happening. So infiltration's kind of a negative connotation. Let's do a better word. Some of the mixture that's happening, the diffusion that's happening from Shiraz, because we're seeing a very different setup. We have some landscape, but rather than positioning things sort of on that flat plane, trying to give that illusion of depth, we have a horizon line that's kind of near the front. So it's still flat, but we're not just arranging everybody vertically to try and give that sense. We're actually trying to use some of the landscape around it to give you that sense. And we're getting a much more colorful palette and a lot more fill as opposed to showing you the bare page even through the drawing. So we are going to go in and look at Shiraz. And there was a lot of influence going back and forth between the two. Early on, Shiraz stuff looked a lot like the Tabrizi style. And then it shifted. So there ends up being at least 3 different Shirazi styles. Middle Shiraz style is more like what we just saw from that last one from Tabriz. And that middle style circled back around to Tabriz as governors fall and some painters or poets fall out of favor. They move to the next city over and they take that style over there. So we can see some of this shifting back and forth. What we see in the middle Shiraz style, that break from that kind of wash and show the bare page style that initially happened in Tabriz, instead we get really bright colors, a solid background, and something that is arranged much more horizontally. It almost looks like a frieze painting like you would see on a building. And symmetry is a really big deal here. There's very little depth. They have really large figures that look like they are positioned right up at the very front of this boundary box. And we start to see either a plain solid color background, and we see figures that are really stiff and locked in position. Something kind of like this. So again, we still have a boundary box happening. We have a little bit happening with breaking the boundary box where some of the things at the edges will cross that line, but it's a very horizontal arrangement. It's very symmetrical where the images are almost mirrored from one side to the other, and everybody is right up there at the very front of that boundary. There's almost no horizon line to give you any depth to happen in it. And we get just very stiff figures. The horses, instead of looking like they're trying to give this idea of motion, they look like they're standing still. And again, this is from yet a different Shahnameh. So we can tell a little bit between the different styles of them as to which workshop they're most likely to have come out of. And again, all of that yellow would be gold, so it would be very, very shiny. Again, we have numerous figures that are fairly large and filling this boundary box. They're right up there at the front of it. And it's not an exact mirror image, but pretty close from one side to the other. So it gives you that really balanced symmetry. and bright colors, and we've gotten rid of the bare page almost entirely. And then we get something very different. This is a very clear departure from the earlier styles, and it's beginning to break even with the middle style. This one is from something called the Great Mongol Shahnameh. It is entirely dispersed. All we have are 57 paintings, but they're not bound together. They're separate paintings at this point. From age and tracing provenance and testing materials, it's thought they all belong to one book at one point. But we're starting to get a little bit more depth, and we're starting to get actual background coming in. So we're breaking from that frieze style, and we're starting to get more of a setting to what's going on. And this is actually probably the latest style, and it's the most like what we're going to see from the 15th century. So we're really starting to get into what's considered the later Shirazi style with this. So we've got three really drastically different styles that happen even within the two major workshops. And those two workshops have artists that go back and forth between them throughout the century. So seeing those styles cycle back and forth between the two, you can almost follow some of the military history or the political history as to what's happening with leaders getting deposed. It mirrors what happens with those styles shifting back and forth between the cities. Most of this, yes, all of the clothes that we see in this, all of the people that we see in this would be recognized by the audience as, oh, that's an upper class person, particularly in enthronement scenes, or oh, that's a servant. But it's not necessarily detail oriented towards this is what people are wearing today, especially with the Shahnameh and the history of the world, where you're looking at some of the origin myths. We definitely get at least a couple of images where people are wearing animal skins. It essentially looks like they're wearing striped or spotted outfits. The best theory on that is that that's their way of showing, hey, these are the ancestors. These are the long, long ago. It's not so much that the person of that time would have been wearing that thing. It's, oh, this is part of the origin myth. So we're going to make it look like something old and primitive, even to this 14th century guy who's painting it. So yes, we can take a little bit from these clothes and say, oh, this is what Persian people were wearing. But if it's being painted by a Chinese guy for a Central Asian guy, can we say that's what Persian people were wearing? I don't think we can just take it that directly. So looking at the history of how these paintings came into being gives us a lot more to question on, oh, this is a Persian painting. So yeah, I will open up for questions at that point. Baraka, do you want to go ahead and stop the recording?
No problem.